chose some loud colored threads here so that everybody can kind of see what I'm working with, even from a distance. To start your wrap, you're going to need to tie what we refer to as a jam knot. All a jam knot is, or all that means, is that you're going to wrap the thread from the spool over the tag end. That's really all it boils down to. So what I like to do is go around the blank once and come up over a second time so you can kind of see it spiral against the blank. And then I like to pick up this thread, the back thread that goes from the machine or your phone book or whatever, and put it over the top of that tag. Now at this point, if I just turn the rod like this, then I'm not picking up any thread because I'm always going to be pulling the slack from this end. And if I let it go, it'll continue to do the same thing because there isn't enough friction on the rod to hold that. So the way around that is to go around the rod once, pick up this thread and put it over the top of that other thread, just like I did before, and then bring the tag around a second time. Now, as I turn the blank, the thread will continue to wrap over the top of the rod. And once I've got 2 wraps over the tag, I can tug on it a little bit, make sure it's tight. And now there will be enough friction that I can continue to turn the rod, and that friction will maintain, keep it wrapping on the rod so it doesn't spin in one place. So that's the jam knot. And of course all that really is
so how many times did you put it on after that?
You can do as many as you like. I like a minimum of 3.
3, okay.
A minimum of 3, but if you prefer, you could wrap 1/4 inch,
okay,
which is probably more like 12 wraps or something.
But you'd see that line then down there, right?
You'd see it tucked under the edge, but that's okay.
Yeah, do you set it up so that it's like hidden underneath the foot, or you don't even?
No, I don't even worry about it. And once you put a finish on it, it'll be really hard to see.
Okay.
In fact, Dave asked me about that another time. But if you look at this, where I cut this tag here, you're still going to have close to 1/4 inch of tag I'm going to wrap over the top of.
Okay.
So it's really not that abnormal. Okay.
What size thread do you use in Q?
This happens to be size D.
D, all right.
Yeah, just big so that everybody can see it. Now, from this point, you just want to continue to wrap. If you're wrapping with a hand wrapper, now it goes like this. If you're wrapping with a power machine, it goes more like this. Okay, now to tie this thing off, you're going to want to wrap over the tag end. But you can't quite do it that way. You can't wrap over the tag end. Instead, you're going to pull the tag end under some wraps, which is essentially the same thing. So the simplest way to do this is to take a section of thread and tuck it underneath the thread you're wrapping on, like this, and then wrap over the top of that. Once you're convinced that you've got enough wrapping over the top of that, I want to put my finger on top of the thread and give myself a little slack here to work with, and then I'm going to cut that tag. Now if I take my forefinger off of here, everything will come undone like a slinky. I want to maintain pressure there. Now I can take this tag end and put it through that loop. And now the typical thing here is to grab hold of these 2 threads and just pull that whole thing underneath. And now what I've done is pulled that thread underneath 1/4 inch of wraps. And that's what holds the whole thing down. Okay?
This is a bear.
Yeah, this is your first time around. This will be frustrating. Okay, so now there's several ways to do this. Eventually what we're trying to do here is cause as few fibers sticking up as we possibly can. You don't want, the simplest thing here is just to cut this off. Now if you get down here and take a close look at this, you'll see there's a tuft of thread sticking up in between those wraps there. Can you see that? Mm-hmm. Okay. No matter how close I try to get down there and trim that with my scissors, I'm always going to have a little tuft of thread sticking up. When I first started wrapping rods, I used to try to cut it with a razor blade as close as I could get it. The problem is either the thread's sticking up, you leave a fiber or 2 uncut and they stand up a little taller, or you actually nick the wrapping threads around it and that has a little fiber sticking up. Any of these little fibers, once we put epoxy on this, that little fiber stands up, it brings the epoxy up with it, it makes a little spike in the finish. Here's one of my favorite ways to avoid those fuzzies. I call those the dreaded fuzzies. Again, over the blank.
Scientific term.
The scientific term. The dreaded fuzzy. I've gone around the blank once, picking up the thread and putting it over that tag end, and then I'm bringing it around the second time, and then just start my wrapping. Once I've got at least 2 wraps on there, then it'll continue to hold just by friction. I can trim this off. So I get to where I want to cut this thing off. I'm taking that same loop, put it underneath, and continue to wrap over the top of it. We'll say at least 1/4 of an inch. Now I put my finger on the end of that so it doesn't come apart like a slinky. Trim the thread. Push it down through this hole. Now here's the difference. I'm going to pull this thread tight now. So now I can take my finger off of it because I've got tension here. Pull on this loop. And what I want to do is pinch that thread tight up against the edge of this thing. Can you see that little dimple or indent there? Yep. What's happening there is I've got this loop of thread pinching that right at the end of the wrap. Now I'm going to get in here with my scissors and cut this thing as close as I can. And when I pull on this tag, it just never comes on. Now here's another one I use a lot. Sometimes you don't have enough space to be able to use 1/4 of an inch over the top of that that loop. When that's the case, this is an alternative. Same thing. All I've done is I'm just going to put my loop under there. Let's say I can't quite get a full 1/4 of an inch, so maybe I've got an 1/8 of an inch. So what I'm going to do here is tuck it through. I didn't pull it tight. Now I'm going to pull this through. I've got the tag sticking out like we did before. Now here's the difference. I want to pull it back the opposite way. You can see there, I left a gap. You see that little tiny gap there? Now you can take your razor blade and cut straight down against that thread, down against the blank.
Push it back together.
And that leaves that little gap, but there's no little tuft sticking up. And now I'm going to take my magic wand we call a burnishing tool.
But now you can only do that on an under wrap, right?
No, you can do it on an overwrap.
Really?
You got to be careful. You know, it's kind of like cutting that heat shrink on the cork tape. You cut too deep, you're going to cut what's under it. So you don't want to be cutting the thread under there.
Robbie.
But you certainly can. I do all the time.
Yeah. They're just jealous.
By the way, this burnishing tool, I'm using it to clean up the edges. If you look at this edge here, see how it's got that dimple where I tucked that under there? I can't solve that entirely, but by rubbing this back and forth like this, and then run it along the edge, see how much cleaner that looks now? Another thing I can do is, if you take a look at this wrap, you can see all those individual threads and everything. You just go over this with the burnishing tool from one edge to the other. And that thing almost comes out looking like it's painted on, you know what I mean? What you're trying to do here, it's all about the angle from the thread to the blank. If let me get going a little bit here.
Because obviously there's a balance. You don't want them to be too far apart.
That's right.
And then rolling over the top.
If my angle is, let's call it negative, meaning the thread's going back the direction I just came from, I do this.
Right.
We don't want to do that. If my angle is too far the opposite direction, let's call that a positive angle, I get this.
Right.
So a mistake a lot of new rod builders make is what they try to do is make it exactly 90 degrees so that the thread goes straight up to the blank. And then they're carefully moving this thing along as it's going like this, and invariably you end up with loose wraps at best, gaps at worst. So the opposite end of that spectrum is if I maintain the right angle, whether I'm turning by hand, I get nice and clean, or if I go nice and fast. If you notice, I'm moving I'm moving my thread carriage along with the rod. It's going slow, but I'm maintaining that negative angle.
Right.
Okay. So any questions so far? So if I were to tie this off, I'm just going to push this loop under here like this. I want to go over that at least 1/4 of an inch. Put my finger on it so it doesn't come apart like a slinky.
So if your measurements are critical, you really got to plan ahead as to when you put that pull string in and stuff.
I eyeball it, but yeah, I wouldn't be, just eyeball it. I cut the thread as close as I could. When you pull it, it just never comes through. By the way, if your tag does come through, you got one of two problems. Either your wrap is too loose, and what's happening is it's loose at the end and it's popping through before it gets to the end. Yep, in between those threads. Or the other problem is you just didn't wrap over it long enough. And my bet is, that's 80% of the time that's going to be your mistake. So if you do it that way and you go to pull it through and the tag end still comes up and through, wrap over the tag a little further next time, and that'll probably be okay.